My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual book talk, Gathered into a Church, Indigenous-English Congregationalism in Woodland, New England, with Lori Rogers-Stokes. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archives resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections to the land continue to this day and well into the future. For those joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, as well as our digital archive with more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. And you're in for a real treat today because we have this fantastic work which has pulled so much from this New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, really anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. I do hope you'll check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. And with that, please let me go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Dr. Lori Rogers-Stokes is an independent scholar, public historian, and contributing editor for New England's Hidden Histories, a digital project of the Congregational Library and Archives. She's the author, of course, of Gathered into a Church, Indigenous-English Congregationalism in Woodland, New England, just out from the University of Massachusetts Press, and Records of Trial from Thomas Shepard's Church in Cambridge, 1638 to 49, Heroic Souls, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. Lori studies the history of Woodland, New England, where Indigenous people and English colonizers took actions that continue to shape our lives today. And I want to thank Lori. I mean, I've only been here for 3 years. You've been involved in this project for much longer, and you have always been so wonderfully generous in sharing your knowledge and your insights and your transcriptions. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done.
Thanks so much, Kyle, and thanks everybody for being here. And I am so happy to share just a little bit, walk you through the course of my book, which would not exist, as Kyle says, without Congregational church records. I started transcribing for Hidden Histories in 2013, and it took me a while, took me a couple thousand pages, but I eventually realized that it represents, I stand behind this hype, the most important primary source archive newly available to the general public for anyone studying early America, the Atlantic world, religion, indigenous history, women's history, the Puritans. It is an astounding archive, and my book is just pulling out a tiny fraction of what you can find there. So I'm happy to walk you through some of the things that I cover in it. Now, I may be preaching to the choir at a gathering hosted by the Congregational Library, but I do just want to start by defining some terms, and I will pick up from what Kyle said in his introduction. Throughout the book and this talk, I use double names for places, starting with Woodland, New England, which is in the title. An English approximation of the name of this place is the Eastern Woodlands. And so I take the Eastern Woodlands, and then the name the colonizers gave it of New England, I call it Woodland, New England. When I talk about towns, it's Hassanamesset, Grafton, and Agawam, Rowley, and Nopi, Martha's Vineyard. Just to show that while you cannot undo the harms, all of the harms of colonization all at once, including renaming, the Indigenous identity and presence of these places is still right here. So that's what I will be doing throughout. Then I'll just quickly define Congregationalism. The Puritans came to this place, they landed in Shawmut because they wanted to create a commonwealth where they had the political liberty to worship God in the one way they felt was approved by God, which was self-governing, independent congregations, hence the name, Congregationalism. This was the religion of the Puritans. But when I talk about my sources, I don't say it's congregational records. I say congregational church records because a concept that was lost over time but persisted here in Woodland, New England for Congregationalists from 1630 to maybe 1830 was the concept of the church body. When a Congregationalist said the church, they didn't mean a building and they didn't mean an institution and offices and people. They meant a specific subset of a congregation. The book is called Gathered into a Church because attending worship services as part of your town's congregation was mandated by law for a long time in these colonies. So towns created congregations, but only God could gather certain people out of those congregations into a church body. These were people who had gone through the Puritan process of what they called spiritual preparation, praying, reading the Bible, hearing godly ministers, talking to other seekers, in order to eventually, ideally, come to an understanding through all of that, that they had received God's assurance of God's grace, what modern Christianity calls salvation. So these people who felt that they received that message and got that understanding would then share a verbal narration of how they got there with members of the congregation, the church, maybe ministers. And when everybody said, yes, this sounds right, so far as we're able to judge, it sounds right, those people were received into the church body. So that's a congregational church. And that church represented the congregation to the world and to God. It conducted all of the business of this group of people, and they did that in their record books. Many of these record books are physically huge and were used, like the same book in many towns was used for centuries. Someone in 1807 picked up the book that was purchased in 1644 and wrote their records in it. I just find this amazing because, again, it's the idea of that church body is the same body. It's not like this church in 1640 and then it was a different church, but it's the same body leaving the same record, testifying before God. They almost considered these record books to be like living creatures who bore witness to God himself of their actions. And so it is that rare primary source where you really understand that people were trying to relate the objective facts. You can't lie to God. So these record books are very thorough and they're very honest, and they are not compiled with an idea to making anybody look good in the future. So that's just another benefit of that testimony that they give. A major thing I began to realize these books were testifying to me was this idea they presented of what I call congregational kinship. And this is where I start the book. A church body was a group of sisters and brothers who were limbs, considered limbs of one body. So any problem with any single member was a problem for the entire body. A body cannot have a diseased member and be healthy and do what it needs to do before God. And so for problems large and small, and there were large problems that happened in the secular and religious world for members of churches, they relied on a process I call rebuke, repent, restore, where an offending member is rebuked, at first in private. And if that doesn't work, then a committee of church members might be drawn in to just talk to them and say, why are you doing this harmful thing? The church body is about reciprocal relationships of care, putting the health of the body before the desires or profit of the individual. So why are you doing this? The person had to be rebuked and be convinced that they were doing something wrong so that then they could authentically repent, to really understand the damage they not only did themselves, but that they did other people, so that everybody could be restored. That was the goal. Restoration. We are all come back together whole. Our diseased member is healed, so we are healed, and there's no lingering resentments. And they took as long as they needed to take to get to that point. And I covered one story in Hassanames at Grafton. It lasted 8 years. 8 years of working with somebody who was causing division and strife, and they finally got there. Because what's more important? You know, we're talking about a body gathered by God. We're talking about people's souls. Yet, this idea of congregational kinship, of course, was not lived out in the secular civil world that these people created, the same people who created the concept of the church body, created secular courts, civil courts out in the world that were totally different, where you and the person you are angry with show up in a court before a judge you may or may not know you. They hear some testimony, and then the judge looks in a book and says, okay, for this crime, you pay this price, and it's done. And kind of the short-term resolution of the problem that probably left one or both parties dissatisfied, and they would end up back in court. Because in the secular world, it's not reciprocal relationships. It's a zero-sum game. I win and you lose. Or if you win, I lose. There's no win-win in the secular world like they wanted it to be in the congregational world. And I really call it throughout the book a lived ideal. This was not just an ideal the Congregationalists had. They lived it out. You see the records of it in every town of applying this rebuke, repent, restore process. Often in the face of an increasingly disinterested civil justice system. So it's this kind of congregationalism, congregational kinship that I'm thinking of when I think of Indigenous converts. This was the part of Congregationalism that appealed to Indigenous people because it had many alignments with their own culture and civilization. The concept of prioritizing the group's welfare above the individual. Having a leader, a sanksqua or sakam, or a minister, who is called by a group and serves them by their consent and does not enrich himself through that service, and then making this long restorative process to ensure good reciprocal relationships. These all would have spoken to Indigenous people. Of course, the one big hang-up is that they had sanksquas, female leaders, whereas, of course, there were no female ministers. But this was something I believe would have been appealing to Indigenous people. It would have been a part of English colonizing society that they sort of understood. And this is a vexed issue that I spend a good part of a chapter on in the book. The question for people studying any Indigenous place is you ask yourself, how could any Indigenous person ever willingly and authentically and sincerely adopt the religion of the colonizer? A term, survivance, is usually used in scholarship to say, look, people did what they had to do to survive. They went through the motions of adopting Christianity so that they wouldn't get in trouble, but there's no way they could or would ever really sincerely practice it. And this idea comes from a good place, right? You want to acknowledge the pressures and the ugliness of colonization. But as I read so many church records of so many mixed congregations and saw the records for so many Indigenous people, it became harder and harder for me to say, look, I see all of your words, but I'm just going to overwrite them and say, you weren't really sincere. There's just no way you would have been. That's not possible. There are clearly so many more records to read to get more light on this topic, as the Congregationalists would have said. But what I really found with church records is that they put a whole new face on the idea of authentic practice. One of the arguments is, well, Indigenous people don't really understand, fully the new religion, and they bring in their own old practices from their own religion, and they make a mix, and it has the terrible kind of insult name of creolization. But I think things that are studied when it's Indigenous people as some kind of Creole, English people do all the time. right? English people do the exact same things. Puritans were boarding up baby shoes into their walls when they built a house to keep out evil spirits. And English people were carving hex marks into their mantelpieces to keep out evil spirits. Every group of people's on a bell curve. The people who are super orthodox, the people who are totally faking it, and then the big group in the middle who are always a mix. So I spend a good deal of the middle of the book talking about two innovations that Indigenous Congregationalists brought to this religion. And they haven't been perceived as Indigenous innovations before. That's something church records showed me and will show everybody else who looks at them. But Congregationalism, if it was anything, it was flexible. As people lived it out in their real lives on the ground, when they encountered a problem that could not be resolved over the years, they were able to change that religion. And that is not creolization. That is being flexible and adapting a living religion to your real lived experience. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. Two concepts that really changed Congregationalism, that were really brought into it by sincere Indigenous Congregationalists. And the first is that concept of assurance that I talked about, that certainty God gave you that you were what people today would call saved. The original English version of this was intensely, intensely personal and hidden. And the word that most people used to describe it was not private, but secret. You prayed internally. You read your Bible. You removed yourself into some kind of hidden space so that you could do all these things for spiritual preparation. And even when you sat in the meeting house listening to the sermon of a godly minister, you were taking notes in your own book. When you spoke with other people, you mulled over what they said, but in the end, it was this intensely personal and idiosyncratic experience. Different people might read the same Bible verse and have completely different reactions to it. It was so intensely secret and hidden that even people who experienced it had trouble describing it to other people. I think always of Alice Steadman, who is someone I covered in my first book, who, when she was talking with her minister, Thomas Shepard, she said, I went to an elder at a low point in my seeking, and here's how she said that he asked what stuck upon my spirit, what was making me feel stuck. And I said, I was afraid it was not righteousness. She thought she was being hypocritical. And he encouraged me not to give way to those fears, she said. But in the end, she couldn't. No other person could give you confidence about your spiritual estate, as they would have called it. Other people could help you and give you counsel, but it had to come from you inside. She eventually found assurance, but not through that conversation. And that was the norm. Now, when we go to Wampanoag Congregationalists on Nopi, Martha's Vineyard, in the time frame I'm looking at is Experience Mayhew, one of the English ministers there, published a book in 1727 called Indian Converts, where he covered the lives and deaths of 128 Wampanoags of all ages, whom he considered to be ideal Congregationalists. Wampanoags by that point, by the 1720s, they were like third generation Congregationalists. Conversion was not their issue at that point. They had been practicing and inheriting this religion for many generations. So while Experience wants to set it up as these people were truly devout, but they did gather in what he calls Indian churches, where there were inevitably some departures from orthodoxy because they just weren't able to practice like we could as English people. And it's easy to take his word for this until you start looking at more of the records and realize they were only doing what English people did all the time, modifying the religious practice to meet their lived experience. And Wampanoag societies, not just in religion, but in the secular society, were much more about reciprocal relationship and belonging. And they developed a concept of assurance that was not intensely personal and hidden and secret and hard to define, but completely based on being with other people. Kinship, that congregational kinship. They report, he records in all of his stories about these people that they found assurance that they would go to heaven when they died because of two things. A, God would not invite them into reciprocal relationship and then watch them practice loving relationship with him all their lives and then refuse them entry. Why would God violate kinship like that? And when they got together with their kin on earth, they encouraged each other. And that encouragement was their proof. I'll give just one example of Eleazar Ohumo, who said, experience says this about him. He sent for some of his neighbors to come and commit him to God, and as he expressed it, to give him a lift toward heaven, which, according to his desire, they did. And they told me, experience, that they were as sure that he was gone into the kingdom of God as though they had seen the angels of God come down and convey him to that place of glory. Experience recounts a few times where someone was dying and he went to visit them and he was like quizzing them. Like, well, do you think this? And do you believe this and this and this? Then, you should feel confident. And couldn't get anywhere. Like the person was not receiving it. It was not making the person feel better. And then when their kin came to them and encouraged them and shared, then they did. Then they had that confidence. And that expansion of assurance was really crucial to the longevity of congregational practice, because after the charter for Massachusetts was lost and a lot of people were coming into the colony in the 1680s who were not Congregationalists, a religion that was so interior and isolated really could have been so alien that these new people would not have been able to come into it. And I feel that this expansion of the idea of assurance was something that overcame that and allowed people who were very foreign to it to come in and understand it. And speaking of foreign to it, this is our second innovation that I want to talk about now. The halfway covenant. I'm going to give you the real nutshell on this. The Congregationalists only observed two sacraments: baptism of infants and taking communion. So if you were one of those full church members, not just in the congregation, but in the church, you could baptize your children. And while they didn't believe this gave you protection in some way or some kind of salvation, it brought you into that reciprocal relationship with the church that was so important. So if you were one of those children whose full member parents baptized you, but you never found assurance yourself and then you had children, you couldn't baptize them. And this, over a couple of generations, became a big problem for a lot of Congregationalists. Like, we are sincere and we are seeking, but we haven't found assurance yet. We can't baptize our children, so they're not in church relationship at all. So in 1662, a group of ministers met together and said, in these cases, people whose parents had them baptized who haven't found assurance can stand up and own the covenant. They can stand in front of the church and congregation and say, I believe in and uphold the covenant of this individual congregation. I'm continuing my spiritual seeking, and I want to be in relationship. And this was called owning the covenant, and this allowed you to baptize your children. And halfway covenant was an insult term at the time. It was like a half measure. It was controversial. Every congregation got to decide if they would adopt it or not. And many did not. A lot of them did not. But what turned that around was Indigenous adoption of it, because so many Indigenous churches were destroyed during King Philip's War in 1675 and 76. Indigenous people who had church belonging had their churches and congregations destroyed as towns were burned, people were killed, and people were sold into slavery. So in the early 1700s, when Indigenous places like Hassanamesset, that had been one of the original praying towns and had a strong Nipmuc church, were suddenly called Grafton, settled by English people, and these English people started a church that they called First Church. Indigenous people had no way to claim belonging in that church, right? Their parents had not baptized them in it. They had no connection to it, but they used the halfway covenant to get that church belonging. They expanded the definition. They said, we have no existing tie to this church, but we will uphold the covenant of that church. We believe in it. We're continuing our seeking, and we want this kind of belonging. And individual congregations of English people accepted this. It's actually such a wonderful surprise to read the records and see that I have not yet found any recorded pushback on this by English people in a congregation. And most of the times in the records, you will see entries of English and Nipmuc people, English and Massachusetts people, all owning the covenant on the same day. There was no segregation. There was no pushback on it. So this opened the door for people with no connection, no existing connection to a church, to come into belonging. And this was helpful again for English people, because as I said, in the 1680s especially, a lot of people start coming in who have no existing tie to Congregationalism. And this, the Indigenous use of it, allowed English people to use it as well. And this is what overcame the remaining resistance to this innovation. And in Hassanameset Grafton, I follow the Abraham family. Andrew Abraham Jr. was the first Nipmuc person to own the covenant in the second gathered church. And that was in 1733. And then shortly after that, his mother, two of his brothers, and his sister all chose church belonging. His father never did, nor did Andrew's wife, Abigail Printer. She never chose church belonging. But Abigail, Andrew's sister, Elizabeth, actually became a full member of the church. She was the first Nipmuc full member of that church. So people who came into belonging halfway through the halfway covenant, most of them, well, I can't say most of them, many of them, a good number of them, eventually became full members. So the halfway covenant became that bridge to full membership for everybody, thanks to the Indigenous use of it. So I'll just wrap up with one story about Ezekiel Cole, who was a Nipmuc Congregationalist in Hassanameset. He was born in 1723. And this is just a story of the power of Indigenous Congregationalism and church records to reveal it. If anyone knew about Ezekiel Cole, it was because he was a footnote in Frederick Clifton Pierce's 1879 mega history of the town of Grafton, where Ezekiel appears as a footnote in a story, a very apocryphal story about the minister, Solomon Prentice, that he had to apologize to the church for going hunting on Thanksgiving Day. And Pierce is like, oh, you know, he was just another one of those chaotic Indians, probably because he, like so many Indigenous people, was lured into English religion for the first time by the Great Awakening, which was a big challenge to Orthodox Congregationalism. The Great Awakening was evangelical religion that didn't follow any of the practices or tenets of Congregationalism. And without church records, the scholarly take has always been like, oh, this really appealed to Indian people because they didn't want to join the English church and they loved the free form and chaos. You know, it's a very sadly racist take. And that's how people knew Ezekiel Cole. He was just another one of those militant Indians. Well, the church records of Hassanameset Grafton show that Ezekiel Cole actually owned the covenant and became a full member of that church in February of 1743. And a year later, in February of 1744, he accused the minister Solomon Prentice of teaching damnable doctrine. Long 4-year story short, I transcribed this over dozens of pages. Solomon Prentice was a secret new light. He had been won over by the Great Awakening, but he was hiding it and lying about it. There was a certain group in the church who said, You don't seem the same. Something is up with you. Are you a new light? It's like, no, 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 I would never do that. He didn't want to be dismissed by that church. He wanted the church to actually break apart. And then he could pick up the pieces and start his own evangelical church. It's so devious. Ezekiel Cole found this out early because Prentice was going around informally preaching new doctrine to indigenous people, hoping that they might be early adopters. But we know this is not true. By that point, by the 1740s, indigenous people, Nipmuc people in Hassanameset, Grafton, had been Congregationalists for 70 years, and they were not going to be swayed. So from 1744 to 1747, there was an epic battle in that church. And one of the greatest quotes of any church record book comes from it, where they had to call in an outside council to try and come in and mediate their differences. And he crossed his fingers behind his back and said, absolutely, I will absolutely do what it takes to heal this church because I'm Orthodox. And then he wrote in a postscript, he wrote, P.S. I just want to write here in this church record book, because it is testifying before God, that it was never my intention to comply with that. Not ever. So Ezekiel Cole is actually the person who found this out, helped the church pursue it, and to remove this person who was doing so much damage to that Orthodox church, which is a pretty amazing story. And Ezekiel Cole remained a member of that church, I think, until his death. One of the great things, again, about church records is that they are so much more complete than town vital records. Church records would always include someone's race. If they were not white, they would call them Indian or Negro. And it's like a good result from a bad thing. We see records of these people in church records where if I look at the vital records of Grafton, I don't see any indigenous people at all after a few years, and not even a lot of Black people. So I don't have a death record for Ezekiel Cole, but in 1778, he appears in a list that the minister Daniel Grosvenor made of active members. So that's such an amazing story. And I'll just conclude by saying, I end the book by saying this idea of congregational kinship had the power to be really transformative. If English people could have not just relegated that to their religious life, but brought it into their secular lives, how different might the world we are living in today really be? It is a real lost opportunity that eventually even congregational churches, by the time of the break in the early 1800s, even their way had kind of weakened a little bit. And one of the great value of church records, final value I'll mention, is reading these records shows you that a different path could have been taken. Our certainties about what's inevitable are misguided. And maybe it's an opportunity that we can recapture as we move forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lori. Let me just, kind of start with a bigger picture question. And I love how you talk about this in the introduction, so I want to give you time to air more on it. How does the story really start to change when we recognize that many of these churches were interracial in the 17th and 18th century? And, why is it that we've forgotten that? Why is it that we feel like hidden histories has to uncover that? Why was that ever hidden in the first place?
Such a good question. Richard Bowles has done such great work in his book, Dividing the Faith, to talk about how, yes, there was a deliberate effort to resegregate churches, but that would make you think, well, they would have to harken back to that integrated history, but it just doesn't happen. And I think part of it is that these records have been lost. Like church books, you know how hard it's been to find a lot of these. And once found, like, they need to be transcribed. They could have been hard to read. But also, people like that historian of Grafton, Frederick Pierce, they will quote tiny fragments of church records. They saw them somewhere. Somewhere they saw those records. And they just obscured it. Like the quote he pulls about Ezekiel Cole having to apologize for hunting is right below. It's the entry below, I'm sorry, above the one that says Cole was accusing Solomon Prentice of teaching damnable doctrine. They're right there. It shows that Ezekiel Cole was a church member, and he just skipped it. So by the 18th century, when we had to redefine ourselves as a nation that was just white, people who could have told the truth just didn't. And then the books were just mostly missing.
Thank you so much. Let's jump over to these questions. So, excuse me. Anna Swingeren, our great friend in the Southwest, asks, was being received in the church body in the 17th and 18th century the same for everyone, regardless of race or gender?
Yes, it was. It meant that you stood up, like after the church service, they would ask the congregation or just the church to stay, and you would own that covenant publicly. And then if you weren't baptized yourself, you would be baptized. And if you had children, you brought them and you baptized them right then and there. Or maybe you might wait, but you could do it right then and there. And it was absolutely the same for everybody. If they didn't insert like Indian, you would not know that it was different groups of people. And sometimes that's really made clear by the fact that someone had to go in afterward, the minister went in afterward and put a caret in and like wrote Indian. I forgot to put that in there. I forgot to put that, Elizabeth Abraham was Indian. It was identical.
But once they're part of the church body, are there ways in which the biases of the secular world still creep in? You mentioned kind of leadership roles, right? That have gender restrictions on them. Are there other ways that you saw that in the records?
Sadly, there was segregated seating. So Indigenous people sat up in the gallery, and so did women. And it can be English women, like white women. Now, every congregation made their own decisions about this. So not every congregation did it, but often they did. And it's funny that this is never, ever, ever mentioned unless they are reseating a meeting house, and then they'll talk about it. But otherwise, you would absolutely get the impression that everyone was just sitting all together like people do in churches today. So the seating was segregated. Women could not be on, they couldn't attend church meetings in an active role. They could testify in a church meeting, and so could Indigenous people, but they didn't serve on committees, and they didn't have those kind of leadership roles officially. Scholars like Frank Bremer are uncovering that, just because the record doesn't officially say we let women and Indigenous people do this, doesn't mean it didn't happen.
David Perez asks a really important methodological question, which I know you've wrestled with. American Indian nations did join congregational churches. However, they might not have been the ones writing down their own testimony in these records. How do we methodologically contend with or read the testimony which was written through a colonial translator? Do we confront the risk of colonists maybe shaping the narrative of Indigenous peoples in the archive? So who was writing this down? Do we know? And what do you do if somebody else is writing your story down?
Whenever church record books were actually being written in, it was almost always the minister doing it. The only time it wouldn't be is if there was a church meeting and there was a moderator specifically assigned to take notes because the minister was busy in the meeting. So it's the minister writing these things down. And if things were shaped, and again, we have to remember what they thought these books were. You're not going to change what happened if you're writing something you think God is reading. God's going to know you're lying. So if things were shaped at all, they were shaped for everybody, for English people, for women, for Indigenous people, for Black people, because there is striking similarity. And I don't think it's because they just, faked a template and then cookie cuttered it. I think if you wanted to join a congregational church, there was a way to do it where you owned the covenant, and there wasn't a ton of variation in that. The beauty of it was simple. You stood up while someone read that covenant that said what they believed, and you said, I attest to this, yes. So, they were all represented that way. And I confidently said in my book, like, one caveat is we don't have church record books for all of those pre-King Philip's War Indigenous churches. They're out there, maybe some of them are still out there, but they're not in hidden histories yet. Richard Bolt's just put me onto one that is a Wampanoag church record book that I'm just starting to look at, where it has the Wampanoag pages that the ministers wrote in that language, and then a later English translation that was attended to by Indigenous people, Wampanoags. So I'll be very interested to see if there's any variation, but I was reading baptismal records. They seem very much the same so far.
Well, thank you for that answer. So our friend Noah Bailey asked, did grounding assurance in kinship transform assurance from a subjective assessment of the self to maybe an objective assertion of God and the church? In other words, what was the content of the encouragement that fellow believers are giving to each other in this search for assurance?
It's interesting that this is one time where we really, so far, just have experienced Mayhew's account of this. But so often he'll say, like, I wasn't there, but these people came to me later and said, these Wampanoag people came to me and said, here's what happened. And it seemed, they didn't go into a lot of detail, but if somebody was dying, and then he always included that in the account, and if somebody was questioning whether they could belong to a church, when Indigenous people were thinking, like, should I seek full church membership? They would go to their family and their minister and other church members, and they would just all talk about it. And then they would say, yes, they all said to me what I felt inside, which is that, yes, I could. He mentions, I think, just maybe 3 or 4 people, Wampanoag people, who said, no, I need to go through the English assurance thing. I need to give a relation, and I need to do this privately and personally. But otherwise, even some of the ministers, Wampanoag ministers, were ministers before they joined the church. So it was a very flexible situation.
So John Putnam asks a question, which is one of the ones I had in the back of my mind too. So your book is covering the 17th and 18th century, but you're really kind of focusing in King Philip's War to the Great Awakening. And you brought up King Philip's War in your earlier answer. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what you see King Philip's War doing to the Indigenous relationship with congregational churches? How significant was the impact of the war and the war's aftermath in reducing, I think is our assumption, but you might have a different verb you'd use, Puritan and congregational attempts to proselytize among Indigenous people? Does it cast a shadow? So maybe start with that. Where is that moment in this story, and what is it doing?
It's really interesting. My perception is that a lot of English people thought that this could be the end of sharing this religion with Indigenous people, because the praying towns were attacked, and places like Hasnameset, they really just tried to destroy it. And when people were physically forced to leave their place, you're not gathering into a church if you're not all physically there. And so the English sweep in, they change it to Grafton while Nipmuc people are returning, and they found their own congregation. God gathers a new church that they call First Church. So I think, I can't know, and I don't have the records of these people exactly, but when I look at the story of someone like Abigail Printer, who's such an amazing person, she married Andrew Abraham. What you see is some people, you see a real generational gap. Like people like Andrew and Abigail, who were born in the 17 teens, their parents would have been young people during the war. So maybe their grandparents had been church members in their place. And maybe their parents had even been baptized. And then the war came, and that church was gone. So the new generation, they each have to make their own decision about belonging. Will I attempt to reclaim my congregational identity, or do I feel after this war like it's not mine anymore? Like it really is an English religion. And you see everyone's different choices. And this again was powerful to me, that people were not forced to join churches. Andrew Abraham chose to. His father didn't. His wife never did. 2 of his 3 sons did. Everyone had to make their own decision about whether they felt like they had a congregational identity that they wanted to assert. And in those original playing towns like Nahotek, Natick, and Hassanamasik, Grafton, they did. Not everybody, but there were certainly a large number of people who did that. And that may show how deeply they had actually converted to that religion. They considered it their own, and they weren't going to let English people take it from them, which is kind of the opposite of what you might expect, but not for everybody.
Your answer is dovetailing nicely with an early question that Duncan Ness had asked. You're sharing so many rich stories about people having the agency, right? Having the ability to go through a spiritual process and to be welcomed into a church that validated that process. But you also kind of shared that this is also a world where the civil laws require attendance in these communities. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that place, for the folks who are not ever going to put themselves forward for church membership, but felt that they were there because society expected it. And does that last? Is that just a 17th century phenomenon, or do you find that that's still there? Are they another part of the story, I guess, if that makes sense?
Well, again, I think the colonial government in Massachusetts mandated attendance in the congregation. They wanted everybody in that meeting house on Sunday. But again, there was no pressure on you. People were, in fact, intensely afraid of, like Alice Stedman, being hypocrites, saying, yes, I have assurance, I should join the church. They're always like, oh my gosh. And you see where the encouragement of their kin could have been so helpful to them. They were very scrupulous, is the word. I am not going to put myself forward for church membership if it is not 100% for real to me. So it was actually, a very encouraging culture. What you learn when you read people talking about their experiences is anytime someone said, I've been I've been seeking assurance for 20 years now. It's just not going to happen. I don't have it. I mean, I would have found out by now. And everybody's response is always, oh, don't say that. You don't know that. You don't know that. No, you have to keep trying, which you can see as a negative, like, oh, I've got to keep trying. Or they definitely saw it as a positive. That's why even when they hadn't gotten to that point themselves, they wanted to own the covenant and make sure their children were still in this tradition with them. So there was no pressure from the civil government for people to join churches. It really would be the opposite, keeping that church body, what they would have called visibly righteous, was extremely important. Disestablishment, it stopped being the church that everyone had to pay taxes to support, after the revolution. But that's a long time into it before that mandate went away.
So Andrew Belly, another great friend of the CLA, says thanks you for this excellent work, and shares that Samuel Eliot Morison, the 20th century historian, had made the point that because the right to vote was tied to one's church membership, it was radically inclusive. Wealth and status didn't make you a voter, but membership in the church did. How expansive is that? He asked, were Indigenous members voting? Is there a way to get at that in the records that you're seeing?
That's such a tricky issue, and I'm guilty of getting pretty defensive about it. That only lasted for 30 years. They stopped that in the 1660s. But yeah, you can have a very positive read of it. You don't have to be the rich guy in town to vote, or even be voted as a delegate to the general court, the representative legislature. But of course, female church members didn't get to do this, and Indigenous and Black church members didn't get to do this. None of them ever joined the general court. But we do have a lot of records that show that female and Black, and probably Indigenous people, would be involved in voting in their towns. And you kept that under your hat. Like, these were people who were respected within the church, and no one was going to say to them, well, you can't. They just didn't publicize it. So, it was not a fair and just system, but some towns, did take that concept of kinship, they honored it. Like, if you're a church member, you're supposed to be able to do this, so you can.
Susan Staves, who I think you saw at the conference last Saturday that we had here at the CLA, shares that the combination of rebuke, restore, repent, she's seen as also a feature of early modern ecclesiastical justice in the courts of the Inquisition and those in the 17th century Church of England, as the Puritans who had fallen afoul of the system knew. So suggesting, to some extent, they were perhaps replicating a system they knew, but that one of the issues in comparing the use of such systems is how the sanctions work. Are they limited to banishment from the community, as for the Quakers, whether they include physical punishment, as the Inquisition did? Thinking about, and I think you did a nice job of kind of laying out what they saw as the sanctions and the motive for pulling back around. She sort of asked, what do we do about understanding pre-contact Indigenous sanctions, for thinking about the argument you're making about Indigenous peoples kind of seeing a system that might have felt familiar and one that they could embrace. How have you sort of approached those communities where we don't even have as many records? Maybe so if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, again, I don't have, expertise in oral records of Indigenous governance, but the biggest harm that could befall you as a church member would be to be barred from communion. So if you really would not come to repentance, that the first step that they would take that was heavy duty was to say, you can't take communion next Communion Sunday, you're debarred. Because you're not functioning as a member of this church. So it would be a lie, it'd be hypocritical for you to take communion and for us to take it with you because we are not in communion. And if this didn't work, then process of excommunication might begin when you're really thrown out of belonging. So the two strikes are against your belonging. And again, this has so many alignments with Indigenous society where belonging is everything. And you take your identity from being part of a reciprocal relationship group. So those were the sanctions, not being able to be part of the community. And thus, when you're not part of the community here on earth, you are distanced from God. And you're opened up to the predations of Satan. So again, I should say, there are similarities with Indigenous civilization in this. I should say, as I do in the book, this does not mean that English Congregationalists acknowledged this, welcomed it, talked about it, thought, wrote down and said, gosh, this validates, this Indigenous culture. But they are there, so I'm not as, I think it's Marie Taylor says, I'm not trying to make a more sympathetic colonist. So these similarities were there. I think probably most English Congregationalists thought, yeah, that's because our system is right. But I think in both situations, being cast out of the group identity would have been the worst thing that could have happened to you.
I wonder in our final few minutes if we pivot a little to thinking about today. And one of the things that I so appreciated in your acknowledgments was the Indigenous educators and scholars that you've talked with and shared your scholarship with. I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about your process, what that gleaned for you and how maybe that helped your thinking on this, but also what their responses, what their reactions are to your work.
Unfortunately, I started working on this book in 2021. Everything was still shut down from COVID, and especially Indigenous people were really hit hard by this. And so nobody had time, to spend talking to me about my book, which I completely honor. And even a lot of events, that I might have attended had to be postponed. So I was mostly emailing with people, and I had really wonderful conduct for my friend Lance Young, who I thank in the introduction, and then Ray Gould from the Nipmuc tribe. At that time, I can't remember if she was, what her tribal role was, but she is also a wonderful scholar at Brown. And she put me on to a lot of people who are doing archaeology, like Steve Silliman with the Pequots, and indigenous archaeologists, anthropologists, who one of the great contributions they're making is they're saying, you know, you can't say that if indigenous people's culture changes, they're not indigenous anymore. Everyone's culture changes. So if indigenous people are doing Christian burials, it doesn't mean that they weren't indigenous anymore or they lost their culture. Everyone's culture evolves and takes on new things without it meaning that you've lost your identity. And that was so really fascinating for me, you know, to learn about, and obviously helped shape how I was looking at indigenous people who converted. So way back in the day, Ray Gould said to me, when you're done with your stuff, maybe you want to share it with our tribal council at one of our meetings. And I said, yes, I would love to. So this past June, I actually did. And I told them, like, look, Hidden Histories is here for you. Come and look at the whole record of Hasna-Mesa at Grafton. Look at all the records, you know, see who you find. And, you know, I've talked about Elizabeth Abraham, who was the first full church member. Her descendants were in that meeting. And they knew her as Betty Abraham. And it was just wonderful in a couple ways because she chose to, eventually she disappears from the church record. For whatever reason, she left church belonging. But her descendants are still here and still in that belonging. And it was just so wonderful to make that connection. You know, this is history, but obviously we are all its living descendants. And that was such a great moment.
Love that. Well, let's end with one fun question that's been submitted. If you could banish one stereotype or misconception about the Puritans, just wipe it away so you never had to hear it again, what would that be? What?
Oh gosh, just one.
Just one. Just one.
I do my favorites talk about 5 myths about the Puritans. I think it would be that their religion was harsh and focused on punishing people, and that they lived lives of misery. It's just not true at all. You know, the whole congregation ideal was so encouraging and restorative and positive that I hate that stereotype that, you know, all they did was excommunicate and burn and hang and attack and shun. Yeah, that's what I would get rid of. And that they were all white. Maybe that's the biggest one.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great one to end on. So everybody out in Zoom land, please go ahead, and if you haven't ordered a copy already, go ahead and do so of this fantastic book. Lori, thank you so much. I know I'm speaking on behalf. We didn't get to nearly a fraction of the questions, so I will send those to you so that you have.
Oh, great.
Thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself with us, with New England's Hidden Histories over the year, and with this book, and with us today. So we're the
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Right. Well, we will see you all at the next virtual program. Take care.